Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us here this afternoon. We've got a very exciting session for you, and I am joined by the brilliant Mr. Dan Berry, who is our behavioural science specialist. We have HS, who leads our IACT consultancy offering across the region, and Camper Rom, who will be offering her insights from a local market and culture perspective. I'm now going to hand over to Dan Berry to kick us off.
Thanks, Matthew. Hi, everyone. I'll get straight into this. I'll introduce myself a bit more, and then we're going to start by doing an experiment among everyone. But to say a bit more about behavioural science at H+K, so we've had a behavioural science unit at H+K now for over 4 years. We're based in London and New York and Dubai, and extending that to other parts of our global network. I'll go on in a moment to say a bit more about what behavioural science actually is, because that may be new to many of you. For those of you who have come across it before, it will be a refresh, but in particular, how we actually apply it into communications and PR strategy, which may be newer. Before we get into that though, I'm going to do an experiment with everyone, and if you'd like to take part, you'll need to get something to write on. So I'll just give you a moment to get a pen and paper to write on, or you can type into your laptop if that's easier. You don't have to show this to anyone, it's only for yourself to take part in this experiment, and it's going to take about a minute or two. I'll just give you a moment to get a pen and paper. I'll reveal afterwards what this is about in case it's a bit mysterious and not what you expected for the start of this session. I promise it'll be interesting. Okay, so if you've got a pen and paper or something to write on, what we're going to do is I'm going to read you a list of words. When I've finished reading those words, I want you to write down as many as you can remember. Okay, so no cheating and writing down while I'm talking, but write down as many as you can remember. Okay, so here are the words: dream, bed, night, mattress, snooze, sheet, nod, tired, night, artichoke, insomnia, doze, blanket, night, alarm, nap, snore, pillow. Okay, write down as many as you can remember. I'll give you about half a minute. I can hear scribbling from across the whole region. When I've done this in rooms with people at this point, people start running out of words to write down, but just a few more seconds. Okay, let's pause there. So if we were all together in a room at this point, I'd ask for shows of hands. So you'll have to do that remotely to yourself, but do play along if you'd like to. So first of all, just have a look through how many words you managed to recall, because actually I read just under 20 words, and typically people only remember about half of them. So there's an immediate, if somewhat obvious, lesson for us in communications that we can't recall all of the information that we're bombarded with. In fact, some of it we immediately forget, and listing things is hard to recall anyway. But nonetheless, even in the space of a few seconds, having done this experiment with lots of people, typically you would have forgotten half of the words almost immediately. So that's the first lesson from this sort of task, that our brains cannot possibly process all of the information that we're bombarded with. But I'm going to ask you a few other questions. So first of all, did you write down the words dream and pillow? Have a look through your list. And typically most people do get dream and pillow, even if they haven't recalled all the words. And that's because dream and pillow were the first and last in the list. So when we're bombarded with more information than we can process, we tend to remember the things that come first and last. Okay, it's fairly obvious, I suppose. So next question, did you recall the word artichoke? And nearly everyone gets artichoke, nearly everyone. And that's because it doesn't fit with the list. It's surprising. So we remember things that are surprising. Okay, let's move on. Did you recall the word night? Look, again, almost everyone gets night, and that's because I actually said it more than once. I said it 3 times. So there's a repetition effect, and this is worth reflecting on for a moment, actually, because often in communications we're drawn to create new, fresh ideas. But actually, given that people can't recall all of the information they're bombarded with, sometimes repeating the consistent messages is the best way to cut through with people. So that may rub up against, new, novel sometimes. Another question, did you recall the word sleep? Have a look through your list. So normally about half of people recall the word sleep. But interestingly, and this is the point of the experiment, I didn't say the word sleep. Some of you may have quite a strong memory that I did. I promise I didn't. But of course, all of the words are about sleep, bed, nights, mattresses, things like that. So what your brains did, about half of you on average, you would have, your brains would have filled a logical gap that wasn't there. So you may even have a strong memory for this. I've been in rooms with people and they've insisted that I did say sleep, and I promised I didn't. But it's one of those quirks of how the mind works, that we jump to conclusions, we fill gaps that feel sensible, they feel right, and that can even be quite a strong sense that creates in us. And I do this experiment by way of an introduction to what behavioural science is in communications, which is that we're bombarded with more information than we can process. So what we do pay attention to, the things we remember and care about, and then that influences what we go on to do, they're not random, they're actually more understood than ever. And we build that into how we then engage with people. And that's what behavioural science is in communications. I'm just going to spend the next couple of minutes just saying a little bit more about the science, which will be a refresher for some of you, and then to show some case studies to bring this to life of what this actually looks like in communication. So the next slide, I often show this as an introduction to really what our focus is, which is that in the real world, often our behavior can seem irrational. So maybe we can all relate to this image that we might have the knowledge to do something, like in this case, to get fit. We may be motivated, we've paid for a gym membership and we're going to the gym, but then something has happened in the real world that means we do a seemingly crazy thing, like take the escalator up to the gym rather than take the stairs. And whether it's about using escalators rather than stairs, but I'm sure we can all relate to this sort of thing. We may see in our colleagues, in our families, and in ourselves that people's behavior can sometimes seem surprising and irrational, crazy. So even when people have the knowledge for something, even when they have the knowledge, they still don't do the thing that they should do and that they say they should do. So behavioural science is 2 things really. Firstly, it's better getting into the heads of people when they do these seemingly irrational things. So why are people doing that? Because it's not random and it's not really irrational. These are now better understood than ever, and they're often categorized as behavioral biases in the jargon. So it's understanding people better, which of course we need to do as communications professionals. But then the really good bit, I think, is using that understanding to better engage with people. So go with the grain of how people actually are in the real world, even when their behavior and their decisions may seem a bit strange. Go with the grain of that rather than fight it, and build that into how we actually communicate with people. And that's what we'll show you some examples of in a few moments. So a little bit more on the science on the next slide. That psychologists and behavioral economists who work in this area, and that now includes 3 winners of the Nobel Prize, this is really grounded in very robust science. They often categorize human thinking, our decision-making processes, in 2 systems. So we like to think we think like Sherlock Holmes. So we imagine that you're making a decision about your health or something in your business. You like to think you think in a controlled, effortful, conscious and rational way, weighing the pros and cons of a decision. Actually, next slide, more of our decisions throughout the day, throughout all of our lives, are driven in an uncontrolled, fast, effortless, unconscious way, more like Homer Simpson than Sherlock Holmes. And this isn't to say that people are stupid, because if you're a fan of The Simpsons, you'll know Homer isn't a clever character, he's stupid. It's not making that point at all. It's saying that we go with our gut reaction rather than carefully weighing the pros and cons. And this is actually most of our behavior most of the time, and not just consumers when they're in a store, but also us when we're in the workplace. We jump to conclusions and make uncontrolled, effortless decisions. And a bit like the experiment we did a few moments ago, and some of the other examples we can show you, some of these things can seem a bit strange, but they are grounded in really good insights into what actually influences people's decisions, and grounded in psychology and other sciences. So next slide, please. So our contention at Hill and Knowlton, which is why we set up the behavioural science unit 4 years ago, is that as communications professionals, we have a Sherlock Holmes bias. Actually, we tend to design communications strategy all the way through to like tactical execution details, assuming that our audiences are Sherlock Holmes, that they're consciously paying attention, they're remembering everything we tell them, and they're carefully weighing the pros and cons before making a decision. And that's just not the case. It never has been. It's just not the way humans are built. So we really need to get with the times as an industry and build in these other approaches into how we better communicate with people. Now, this is completely true, and hopefully this does resonate with some of you. But you may think at this stage, well, where do I start then? If consumers aren't making rational decisions, how on earth do I design communications campaigns to adapt to all of these weird quirks? And on the next slide we'll show, but I won't dwell on it today, but what we've developed is think of it as a starting point or a toolkit of 7 of the most relevant insights from behavioral science that we can build into communications campaigns. So that's from detail all the way through to strategy. I won't run through that today, but maybe we can share some of this afterwards if you're interested and come to it in questions. But what I've done on the next slide is just pick out a couple of these, the most relevant insights that we've that informed the case studies that me and a colleague will run through in the next few minutes. So the next slide, please. So 3 of these insights, let me just take a minute on this slide, because there's some jargon that may not be too familiar or helpful. So firstly, satisficing. This is a horrible term, really, but what the point it makes is quite simple, I hope, is that rather than seek to get the best option from things, so think of consumers making a purchase decision. Typically, they don't seek the best, surprisingly, to optimize. They seek a sort of okay, make do, good enough option, and that's what satisficing means. It combines the words in English satisfy and suffice. So we don't seek to optimize. And the reason I've picked McDonald's as an example is because maybe some of you McDonald's fans like me or work at McDonald's. McDonald's, I don't think, claims to be the best burger ever, but it's always good. It's always okay, right? If you're in a new town or an airport and you want a burger, you'll know that McDonald's is always clean, it's always quick, it's always consistent. It may not be the best, but McDonald's has built an entire business model on this insight. So we need to accept that people don't always seek the best. They often just want a good enough outcome. So quickly, 2 other insights. I could spend all day on these. I'm doing this quite rapidly. Social influence, which simple to explain. Humans are a bit like sheep. We copy the behavior of other people around us, particularly people we see as similar to us. So this isn't a rational decision. This is a Homer Simpson type gut reaction. We intuitively copy what other people do. And then framing, which explains a broad set of approaches for precisely how we describe the costs and benefits of something. Can make a really big difference on whether people act. So for example, if you perceive the benefits come from your own experience, those tend to change behavior more than if you read them in a book or in the media, because we take disproportionate notice of our own experience compared to objective facts. And we'll show this in a case study in a moment. So it's just a very quick example of some of these insights that inform campaigns. I'm going to show you 2 quick examples, and then we're going to spend a few more minutes, me and a colleague, walking through a more detailed example. So firstly, on the next slide, one quick example. And this is really of how we can apply behavioral science into optimizing copy, text, really. So a very straightforward level, seemingly small changes to words or images can make a big difference. So even in a static advert, digital ad perhaps, it can make a big difference. And this is a fairly recent and topical example for everyone around the coronavirus and the actions we need to take to prevent it spreading, one of which is hand washing. There are lots of others, of course, that we're familiar with daily, but around hand washing, still lots of people don't wash their hands regularly enough or long enough to kill the virus, and they risk spreading the virus. And the image on the left is the public health campaign that is still running in the UK. So it's, wash your hands more often for 20 seconds, and it has a nice image of showing, how you can easily pick up the virus by touching door handles and things like that. It's actually quite good. This is from the government rather than from Hill and Knowlton. But what we did was see, well, could we further improve the effect of those messages to get people to actually wash their hands more often and for 20 seconds by just tweaking the message a tiny bit using these insights from behavioural science. And you might have already looked at the other two on the slide. The middle one, we added in that you should do this to protect yourself and your family from catching the virus. And the one on the right says instead you can wash your hands can help you protect vulnerable older people. I'll let you have a guess which one you think was the best. Have a guess in your head. In fact, the one on the right, protecting vulnerable older people, was much more effective in getting people to actually wash their hands than the standard message, and in fact the one about protecting yourself. And we think that's because the insight underlying it is we do care for other people, especially if we can easily bring those other people to life. So we all know an older person, maybe it's a grandparent or a neighbour. So it makes it easy to bring to life that I'm doing this to help them, rather than, maybe surprisingly to some of you, protecting yourself. It's actually more effective to protect other people. And the difference was quite big. It was about 8 percentage points improvement in hand washing, which is not 100%, let's be clear, this isn't magic, but 8% just by changing a few words in one ad is pretty big change. So that's one example. We can apply this just to changing a few words. The next example, it can actually change an approach to how we do campaigns overall. So in this is an example of, I'm sure, familiar to many of our organisations, where we want to take actions to protect the environment and resources like energy and water. And typically campaigns try to persuade people of, the benefits to the environment. If you turn down your air conditioning, say, you can help save the environment or save money. But actually what we found from the evidence is that those messages have some effect, they do. But really, you get more benefit in changing actual behaviour if people see those messages, even in a simple form, but at the exact moment they can make a decision. So in the word cue, you can prompt behaviour change exactly when someone can adjust their heating setting or their air conditioning setting, or when they're running the taps to save water, for example, as you can see in those images. So the key insight there was rather than what we say, but exactly when we say it can make a really, really big difference, because behavior happens in the moment rather than is planned and intended. People get used to habits and so on. I can say more about this in questions if you like. And this was an example. We did this for an energy company, and this allowed them to create evidence-based thought leadership to share with governments and other companies to say, hey, look, here are some practical things that we are doing to cut energy use. So those are two fairly quick examples. One of just how we can use behavioral insights just changing words. Second, how they might lead to a slightly different activation. But I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kamperom, who she and I will walk through a case study which is much more showing how behavioural science is ingrained through the whole campaign strategy development and that process that you might be familiar with. So over to you, Kamperom.
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. I think that as Dan said, that come to look at a case study, we hope that you will understand behavioral science better. And we chose this case study about olive oil market and Berkeley. The reason why we chose this case studies of Berkeley because it is relevant to the culture of many Asian markets, and it is clearly show the impactful role of behavioral science. Here, Northern Thailand was tasked by Bertolli to launch the world's first olive oil category campaign in Thailand. Goal was to drive acceptance of the olive oil category in Thailand and also position Bertolli as the market leader. At the time, the brand has limited presence in the country. Olive oil represented less than 1% of Thailand's edible oil market. And the company also faced an abundance of locally grown incumbent edible oil competitors, priced at an average of 4 times cheaper. Our team started the work by conducting consumer research, segmenting the population, understanding their purchasing habits, and defining current education level around olive oil. Through this, it was confirmed Thai buying habits was influenced by long-standing myths around the product type, including the idea that olive oil cannot be utilized for Thai cooking or heated to high temperatures. Dan, would you like to say something here?
Yeah, I build on this. That insight I mentioned a few minutes ago, with the one with the funny name, satisficing. That people make do with what they have rather than seek the better outcome, even if they're aware of it. I think that was relevant in this campaign too, in that people were cooking with oil. Their food wasn't disgusting. They were eating and enjoying food. So why change now? That was the why risk something different. So that was an insight that informed the campaign.
So you can see that our key challenges is how can we elevate a foreign product with less than 1% market presence and no established local relevance, no media presence into a Thai kitchen staple. What our team did is developing 3-phase communications campaign: educate, engage, and empower. So in the first phase, for education, we design and test messaging around dispelling myths about olive oil and Thai food during vox pop sessions with people on the street. This education campaign was further assisted through the creation of videos featuring olive oil with common Thai street food to reframe social norms. That is to drive home cooking with olive oil as common action. Moving into phase 2, we apply insights from our behavioral science initiatives to confirm our selected messenger or influencer. We chose Chef Nan for our target segments in the context of a brand ambassador. And for Chef Nan, he is a credible and likable influencer for Thai consumers. By using him, the brand was able to begin building local relevance to like-minded consumers. Dan, back to you.
Yeah, I'll chip in here. In fact, if we could just hop back one slide. So often with campaigns, we look at the best influencer or messenger for our brand, and we know that the messenger can be as important as the message itself. And the reason in selecting messengers and influencers, often we might immediately think that the best person is the most famous or the most authoritative, but often in fact it's someone that I can relate to as similar to me, which may not be necessarily the most famous and best chef in the country, but nonetheless someone that I can see as someone similar to me and I can relate to. And that comes back to that social norm insight that I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Right. So after phase 1 and phase 2, we move into phase 3. With the successful engagement in phase 2, we push the elevated value of Bertolli through direct communications in this phase, highlighting the status of the brand and its surprising health benefits. We did this through 2 additional influencers. One of them is a relatable, famous rapper who also, a regular cooker, and the other influencer is a well-credentialed nutritionist. Their online-driven activities were further amplified by on-ground consumer events to arouse the connection with others through food.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of these, real-life connections that often feature in campaigns, because the third of those insights I mentioned before around people how people value risks, or sorry, costs and benefits. So the benefits of a new product, say, we take much greater notice of what we've experienced directly ourselves, even if we've read something in the media. So giving someone even a moment experience of tasting food cooked in olive oil can be much better than, even if they engaged in all of your communications materials. So that's why these real experiential PR activations can be so effective at changing behavior.
So this slide shows you the result we got. After 5 months of the campaign, we measured consumer sentiment towards olive oil and found that Thai consumers that agreed olive oil can cook Thai cuisine increased by 59.4%. 78.7% say health benefits of olive oil is most likely purchase reasons, and using the olive oil as primary cooking oil increased by 18.8%. The success of the campaign also resulted in 10% increase in Thailand olive oil market share. So we helped them grow the total available market for olive oil, and also 10% sales increase for Bertolli by end of the 8-month campaign. So I hope that you are impressed with these case studies. Dan?
I'm impressed. No, it is. Those are fantastic results to show a client, and I think it's just as a final reflection for me before we hand over to HS and discussions. It's a nice example of where through a sort of whole strategy process, seemingly small changes informed by behavioural science can actually make a really big difference. So some of these details really matter, as well as getting it in the strategy right at the beginning.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Kemper. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and just to see how it's intertwined throughout and changing results is exactly what we want to talk about now. And I want to invite HS to join us in the panel so that we can maybe just touch upon, whilst we're waiting for some of the questions from the audience to be collated. HS, could you just touch upon the role of behavioural science within the overall IACT consultancy offering that we're introducing in post-COVID times?
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Dan, for your fantastic presentation, and also Cameron for sharing your case study in depth. So obviously, it is unavoidable that we need to be accepting some changes going forward, and changes are obviously happening around us. What is clear, regardless of COVID-19 or not, is that we all recognize there will be behavioral changes that's happening from consumer, employees, partners, NGOs, regulators, just about every stakeholder that brands and corporations will need to re-engage with as you come back full swing back into business. So over the months, H+K globally, we have been analyzing and studying what are the key focus areas that we should be helping our clients with going forward, and key area to support as everybody come back to business in full circle, and have launched recently a consultancy program called IACT. And in the IACT program, which is rolled out globally, including Asia, which is a customized planning process, consultation process involving various experts like Dan himself, like myself, with all the MDs and seniors across our Asian offices, to actually look at the process to identify, adjust, and change the communication approach in this new norm. So one important part of this process is more proactively implementing the behavioral science into our insight building, messaging, communication framing, and in consumer-facing campaigns. So in Asia, as you've just seen in Thailand's case with Bertolli, we have been doing this, obviously with the insights that we pulled out from some of the behavioral science approaches. Now, we would actually be looking at this more deeply going forward as we further understand that brands and corporations actually hope to better communicate, better engage, better relate, and eventually they want their consumers, employees, and their stakeholders to actually react and behave to what they want to say and what they want them to be behaving as. So we find this more important ever going forward. So that is one of the reasons why of the IACT consultancy offering that we are introducing, that we felt behavior science was a section that we want to pull out and maybe provide some more explanation and bring in Dan together with our experts in Asia to talk more with the group here. So Matthew, that's where we are, and should we open up a bit more for panel discussions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, HS. We have some questions. The first one is, I guess we'll start with Dan, if that's okay. How do you make sure that the approach is culturally relevant across multiple Asian markets?
I'm glad that came up, because frankly, there is a challenge here that most of the underlying academic research from psychologists and behavioural economists has been done in other markets. I think we should be frank about that, in particularly Europe and the United States. And in fact, it's also still true that when these approaches have been applied in communications and marketing, again, most of those have been in Europe and the United States. However, we've learned a lot through that process. And just to reflect from my own country, I'm in London, but people in London, a big city, you know, their attitudes and values are quite different to the English countryside, or how, you know, the values of my parents are different to kids, you know. So there are differences within markets, but I guess to come back to the question of how do we make this culturally relevant, I think there's a body of evidence that we can really learn from that has a lot of promise, and we've seen effect in a range of different European cultures, for example, because Europe is very diverse as well. But I think I think we can progress with some confidence. But to answer the question directly, I think it's a case for testing and learning. Let's try these things out rather than assume what's worked in England or in New York is definitely the same, because it may not be. I suspect there will be similarities, and I suspect there'll be differences, and we need to unpack those through some testing. I don't know if Kamprom, did you want to reflect on that?
I experienced one case study, you know, that we saw the case study from the European market first, you know, and we tried to use a similar message with our audience in Thailand, but it didn't work. You know, but when we test that message, then the result came out as, you know, not good at all. And we have to change the message, you know, for Thai consumers based on the research that we did here locally.
So I think if I could maybe add, you know, obviously Europe is full of many countries with different culture, and, you know, as Dan was stating, you know, there's so much differences that they need to be mindful of. Similarly, in Asia, same thing, the language is different, the culture is different, the consumer mindset could be different. So there's never going to be one solution that fits everything, but that is where I think experts like ourselves and also local experts across different markets in Hill and Knowlton can also add in. By looking at how does that local relevancy or the local differences can apply to a certain messaging or certain insight that we pulled out from looking at behavioral science approaches when building our campaign, for example. And I think that is the beauty of having the experts across the IACT consultancy program that we have. So, you know, this is definitely something more than happy that we would definitely test it out more frequently and be introducing to the clients more frequently going forward.
I think it's certainly obvious there's some brands, global brands, that we will have all kind of experienced as consumers as well as working within the industry that seem to get it right every time. You know, they seem to have the right approach for each market and the right cultural nuances approached. And Dan, do you think that's because behavioral science is ingrained in their entire process and not just kind of built on a certain stage within that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it definitely has to be involved from the start. There is some sort of tactical execution, like the example I gave on the hand washing example. It can be like a final step. Let's tweak the words, but it really should be ingrained right from the beginning if you're going to get the best possible impact.
Right. The next question that we've got is to do with Sherlock and Homer. So that's struck a chord. And are there environments in which we see people using more of their Sherlock mind than their Homer mind, or is it generally Homer mind throughout?
Shall I go first with that?
Yes.
I might try the Camprum afterwards because I think the Bertoli example is good for this. So there are differences. So I think all of us are humans. So whether we're at work or in a supermarket, we're still humans, and that means, and I'm quite convinced by this, having reviewed hundreds or thousands of academic papers now, that we're all people, and we can't suddenly become Sherlock Holmes just because we're now in the workplace. But there are cases where we're more likely to pay attention a bit and concentrate, as it were. So maybe that's a bit more true in some working environments. But the key point, which is why I thought the Bertoli example is really nice, is that campaigns need to appeal to Sherlock Holmes and Homer Simpson, but in the past we've just appealed to Sherlock Holmes. So it doesn't mean you don't try to inform and educate people, because I think is when I'll ask Camprom to reflect. The Bertoli case was, a lot of that was about education, that Sherlock Holmes stuff. It doesn't mean you don't do that. It just means you don't stop there. You also have to do other things.
Right.
Now, on that point, maybe I want to add one thing that strikes me and actually it was a conversation that I had with Dan a few days ago, was that, in the past when we actually look at doing some research, whether it be a desk research or qualitative or FGI type of consumer research, we actually focus more on what consumers say that they're doing, or say what they like or what they don't like, rather than looking at how they behave. The core of this behavioral science, I mean, if I can take the Bertoli case, for example. Now, if we took, for example, their target audience and maybe did a focus group, there's maybe comments that they may be saying, which could maybe put us into a different insight, for example. But what Camprum's team pulled out is the fact that people were actually behaving to not use olive oil because they didn't think they could actually cook with Thai food, for example. So these are actual behavioral points, which I think it's super important to pull out. That is quite different when it comes to taking the insight from behavioral science component.
Sure. Okay. Another question is, can you conduct behavioral science tests with both qualitative and quantitative research?
The way we gather insights and the way we do research tends to be more quantitative, on looking at measuring what people actually do rather than just what they say, for that very reason HS just gave. But a lot of the underlying research from psychology and other related fields, that's a mixture of both. So there's a lot of I'd in fact say that our main research approach is looking at all of that consumer psychology research that exists already, and it can be a bit of a slog to go through. I'm sure many of us, our favorite thing isn't reading academic journals every week, but that's where a lot of the great research exists, and then we need to then tailor that to our own clients, our own challenges, our own markets, which is where our skill set comes in.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on. If you're in markets that are currently in different stages of recovery, so whether they're reopening their business or their market has maybe changed completely in its original nature, what's the best way to utilize behavioral science to drive market growth or brand growth for that particular company?
Can I go first, and then maybe Dan and Campron can add in. Before anything else, we tend to look at what others, meaning our stakeholders, our consumers, are thinking. But before anything else, I think we now are facing time where we need to look at ourselves first and be assured, once again, what is the positioning or what is the purpose of the brand that we are comfortable putting forward. Maybe this may be not directly involved with behavioral science yet, but I think that should happen before actually looking at outside and looking at how do I then now engage my purpose with the stakeholders and consumers. And that's where the behavioral science component, I think, could chip in to get more insights into it. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think some of the behavioral science component are some of those insights that we've seen elsewhere. Like, let me just take one example, that social norms insight, that we copy the behavior of other people. that can spark very quick and very comprehensive change across a society. So, for example, in London, until 3 months ago, no one would ever wear a mask in public. It's different to many of markets across Asia. Now, everyone on public transport wears a mask. And that's not because we're made to do it by the government. It happened through quick societal change of seeing other people wear masks and copy that. And now maybe that could switch off at the same pace as it switched on. And that's what we're seeing through these unprecedented times. It's not even hyperbole to say that. It really is unprecedented. You can get very rapid societal behavior change through these just sort of social connection, just copying what other people do. That's what's triggered the change. So it could go the other way as well.
And then, I mean, obviously the changes have been abundant over the last few months, but one thing that you mentioned within the SMARTER model, which is a word that I always find difficult to pronounce, is reciprocity. And obviously, over the last few months, brands have played a slightly different role, or maybe introduced slightly different products. Could you touch a little bit on how the role of reciprocity has kind of unfolded throughout the COVID-19 era?
Yeah, I'll explain the word because it's a difficult one to say as well as to understand. So reciprocity, it really means sense of fairness in that returning a favour. So if someone does you a favour, it's only fair to return that favour. It's not a contract, of course. It's a gut reaction. A couple of examples. I know in many Western cultures, if you're given a Christmas card, you feel obliged to give a Christmas card back. Or if someone follows you on social media, you feel obliged to follow that person back. It's that sort of sense of fairness. And yeah, we have seen that as a great way to encourage behavior change in response to the virus, like the hand washing message that had the best effect, which said, you can protect vulnerable older people by washing your hands. It really is that sense of, looking out for people who've probably looked out for you in the past, your parents, your grandparents, neighbours, family. Now you can do something for them. That's a powerful way to engage behaviour. I wonder if you've maybe Camprom or HS, have you seen that feature in campaigns in the region, that sense of reciprocity?
It's more call to action in many ways, where it's actually just getting people to not only to return back, but also call to action to actually make the changes. So I guess during emergency situations like COVID-19, it does happen, obviously. But I think of the SMARTER model, there's different components where for some brands, depending on which situation your brand is, it could be a combination of taking a couple of them, or it could be just really deep diving one of them, for example. But it really needs to be dependent on what the brand situation at the moment is. But what is really important is behavioral science approach is it's fascinating. It's also a very important part to look into, but we shouldn't stop there. I mean, it needs to actually be implemented into an insight and then to a messaging, a really call to action type of behavioral changing messaging, powerful messaging, and then also implementing that into a campaign. So, and then also looking at the behavioral science components throughout the campaign is also something that we would advise that the brands do to make the overall campaign more powerful. How
I would like to.
Go ahead, Campbell.
Yeah, I would like to add here about COVID-19 as well, because, my team and I receive questions from our clients, what would be the new normal, not this year. They ask about the next 2 years and how it would impact to the way that they communicate with their target audience, things like that, and we usually say to our clients that what we call new normal here, or now might not be new normal behavior of our consumer in next year, in January next year. So there might be short-term new normal and long-term new normal. So you really need to understand human behaviors, analyze your research carefully, and then to identify the opportunities for your brand to communicate to the right channel, right messages to get the effective result from your target audience.
And on that point, but switching lanes a little bit, I mean, we've seen a lot more work in the internal communication side of things, and obviously behavioral science plays a key role in that. Could you just touch upon that a little bit, please? Maybe HS can kick off.
Sure. Maybe I can go first. So internal communication has never been so important during COVID, and obviously coming out of COVID. And we now have to consider our audience more broadly, where our employees' communication really needs to be planned out and also be very authentic and be executed properly. And during that process, like as if we're doing any campaign with consumers, the same thing. Employees are also part of our important communication audience. So there is no difference in terms of whether behavior science is applied or not. Of course, it definitely can. And this could be a combination of looking at even doing some survey or research across different employee level or title across different markets, for example. So Dan has, I'm sure, a couple example of cases that he's done, probably in Europe. So maybe Dan, you might want to add some insights to that.
I'll just pick one, because you're totally right. I mean, employees are humans too. So, and I'm sure we can all think of examples from our own workplace where, for example, we've introduced a new and better way of working, and yet still people don't do it. I can think of some in my own workplace. I mean, one example I can think, we influenced, prescribing decisions by doctors by using that social norms insight. So we showed doctors where their prescribing behavior was different to other doctors. That was an internal comms challenge. And I mean, for anyone on the call who works in healthcare, doctors aren't easily influenced. They quite independently minded, they're experts, they base their decisions on science, but nonetheless, still these approaches can influence what they do as part of an internal comms campaign. So yeah, I think I'd hate it if people left this call and felt that behavioral science was only relevant in consumer campaigns, when it's relevant anything involving human behavior, which is a lot of people.
Cameron, anything to add there?
We use behavior science with many practice, not just only corporate communications or marketing communications, even public affairs. When you would like to attract the interest of the public on particular topic, behavior science can be integrated into your campaign as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another area that is quite interesting and something that's becoming more and more part of our scope is as brands now start to maybe redefine themselves or build a new brand identity. Dan, if you could just touch a little bit about the role of behavioral science in actually developing a brand that can talk without really saying much in itself to a specific target audience.
Oh gosh, that's a big question, Matthew. It's very early in London. I mean, to reflect, I think often where I can think of a couple of recent examples where we've worked with brands who are doing just that. What we're really trying to get at often is to create some space for them to operate in sometimes, let's say, an already crowded field, and using these insights from behavioral science to find the not obvious way to cut through, because the obvious ways to cut through have probably already been done. Other brand leaders would have done that before. The easy things are done, but it's a way to keep delving into what's some new territory for a brand to find some space that they can own of their own, but not just for its own sake, but still something that resonates with real human beings. And some of those can be where we deliberately find some of those quirks of human behavior, because they're very likely to have been overlooked in the past. That's the territory, and we've had some good success with that, because there's loads of quirks of human behavior. People are complicated and weird, and when you understand that and unpick it, it can be really interesting, as well as effective. It can create interesting stories.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, there's that tribal instinct that people tend to look for, I think, where they want to associate with a brand because of the the arm's length relationship they have with other people that associate with that brand. And so kind of understanding that a little bit from a scientific perspective is obviously a good place to start.
I had one example just to bring that to life a bit, and I was having this conversation just yesterday with a sports company, and they were looking at getting people to do more sports, cycling, running. And often we know this is certainly the case in many Western cultures, people sometimes make decisions when they reach a key milestone birthday, like 40 or 50 and something like that. But actually, so campaigns therefore may appeal to people to, on their 40th birthday. But actually, we found in the evidence that that's not the moment when people make a life change. It's actually a birthday ending in a 9, so 29, 39, 49, because that's when you start looking ahead. That's when you're in the year approaching the big birthday. So it's a very simple insight. It's a bit quirky. It does resonate as true. I saw you nodding, and I've not mentioned this to you before, I don't think. But for that brand, it gave them a new territory to target their consumers in a different way to their competitors, and it's based on science.
So we have one more question from the audience. This one is for Dan, and can you share more about how behavioural science can support stakeholder engagement, for example, with regulators or corporations?
What immediately comes to mind is it can be quite, in terms of stakeholder engagement, when we work in public affairs, for example, we've often, and this comes back to that example I gave around saving energy and water, we often design stakeholder engagement or thought leadership to be very solutions oriented. So rather than a brand going to a government or a business group and saying, we want you to do something, it's them going to that group and saying, look, here's what we can all do. It's a simple thing. We've got the evidence, it works. So I guess that comes top of mind. It's behavioral science can generate very solutions oriented, practical, helpful materials that can contribute to stakeholder engagement rather than asking people to do something for you. It's very helpful. And in fact, because I used to work in the UK government, and when we started this, I've now been working in this field nearly 9 years. It was very much around being helpful, practical. What can we do, rather than making, necessarily claims to do very complex things. Let's do some simple things that can make a difference.
Yeah,
absolutely. Brilliant. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And I think it's along the lines of what we've spoken about previously in terms of internal communications, but how does it apply more readily to topics such as employer branding, which are obviously becoming more and more important as, brands are aligning with CSR initiatives. They are eager to maintain a reduced carbon footprint as they return to growth as the economy picks up. But the role of behavioural science there, Dan, would you be able to touch on that?
Yeah, very quickly to allow colleagues a chance to contribute. Where those initiatives involve behaviour change, so let's say it was a sustainability campaign, we want people to reuse rather than use single-use plastics, for example, that's a behaviour change challenge, or part of it is behaviour change. So that's where behavioural science comes in to help design effective ways to get people to do those things they want, which is typically part of a wider CSR strategy.
Yeah. So if I can chime in, I think of all the area, behavioral science approach can definitely be applied, but more than ever, particularly since COVID-19 and going forward for many corporations, I think sustainability and CSR area is definitely an area that everybody will more focus on, where the elements of behavioral science actually comes in quite strongly. So it is definitely an area that should actually review more applying the behavioral science approach.